Okay, we'll get started in about 30 seconds. I read it, Steph. I saw it. Don't worry. Okay, let's get started. We welcome everybody to another one of the Chamber webinars, probably number 30 we've done in the last couple, 6-7 weeks. So thanks for coming out. Appreciate that. Today we are going to talk about rent relief, what we know to this point in time. And again, a lot of details haven't been released as we anticipated, but we are lucky to have with us today Daniel Richardson. He's a managing partner of BTM Lawyers in Port Moody. A great chamber partner and a great law firm in the community. They do a lot in the community. He's a trial lawyer with experience in civil litigation and in construction and real estate disputes. So he's well versed on all of these topics. So just to let you know, we're going to let you ask questions today. So type in the chat that you want to ask a question, and Steph will unmute your phone or your line, whatever you want to call it, and we'll be able to ask Daniel questions directly. So if you want to ask a question, please do so. Daniel's going to do an opening statement and cover off some of where we're at. And please get your questions ready. Just chat and put in the chat, I'd like to ask a question, and we'll open it up for you. So without any further ado, over to the legendary Daniel Richardson.
Oh, okay. Welcome everyone. Thanks for attending. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I did this a couple weeks ago, and there's quite a few. Put a PowerPoint presentation together covering some important topics. Happy to review any questions you have. Like last time, I think just be cautious about this. It's mainly general advice. Any specific names and parties and whatnot is something that we can't, we shouldn't be discussing in a forum like this. So general questions and legal principles really should be the focus of this. In terms of the commercial rent assistance that's happened, I had made some predictions on some sources at my last seminar. Those proved not to be correct. And they've come out with a program which, helpful for some, but has some real flaws to it as well. And I think they've had some criticism. I know Mike and I at the Government Relations Committee of the Chamber expressed some of our concerns with it. And I think those were echoed throughout the country. But the gist of it is you're probably familiar with. The rent relief requires 70% reduction in revenue. It's relief for April, May, and June rent that essentially is a split of the cost of rent, 50% by government, 25% by landlord, and 25% by tenant, and that the property originally must have a mortgage on it. In the recent days, that was probably the most criticized requirement. It seemed arbitrary. Perhaps it was because this is being dispersed as a loan, and that was the facility for getting the money out there. But we're told by the government that they're fixing that, and that the mortgage, if your landlord doesn't have a mortgage, you'll still have access to this relief. If you qualify and everyone's in agreement. And I guess the issues that I see with it and that I'm hearing from a lot of my clients and partners out there in the community, the revenue threshold is too high or too low, however you want to put it. 30% of your revenue or a 70% reduction is just too extreme. 32% revenue is not going to get you very far, and you probably still can't pay rent. The landlord's requirement to have a cooperative agreement and a collaborative agreement can be a real problem for a lot of tenants that need this for their business. And then, of course, the mortgage was a major issue that seemed the most arbitrary, and I believe that's the one they promised to fix on. So, one of what I wanted to start with is a question that I've had a lot of people have asked me over the last couple of weeks. And I thought I'll just start with that, and then I'd open it up for other people. And that's largely and this is from a tenant's perspective, I'm trying to reach out to my landlord. They're not responding. They're not communicating. What can I do? And whether it was before the rent relief, asking for the rent relief, or just something in general, there's just no response. And the challenge here is that there's not much legally you can do. It's all permissive. You've got an agreement, it's all in the lease, and if the landlord's maintaining its part of the bargain, it's giving you the space and doing whatever else it has to do under the lease, there's not much reason for necessary communication. Most leases have a notice provision, so there's a technical place where if you have a letter, you would send it there and you can prove that they received it, but they may not respond. And I think that perhaps the most effective way of getting a response is also the riskiest, and that's not paying rent. And that's, and I explained in my last seminar the risks that come with that, particularly when you may be personally liable for your rent, because you empower the landlord at that point to potentially terminate the lease and sue you for the balance. But I think in the current climate, most landlords are motivated to participate, likely won't kick tenants out if they don't feel they're good tenants usually. And so sort of not paying rent might be a good business decision, perhaps not a legal one, but a good business decision to get that response that you want. Otherwise, squeaky wheel gets the grease, but there's no legal requirement for them to respond to requests to alter your agreements.
Okay. If you got any questions, please just enter the chat button down the bottom bar there. Go to the bottom. There's a chat button. Just put your name in there, or just say, I'd like to ask a question or question mark, and we'll open it up there to your questions. So don't be shy. Don't be bashful. Ask away. Anybody got questions? So far, nobody's got a question. I got a quick question for you, Daniel, about they reduced the school tax, the amount of school tax you have to pay. Does the landlord have a legal obligation to pass that along to the tenant, the deduction?
Yeah, I mean, most triple net leases, well, you've got your base rent and then you've got your operating costs and taxes. And those are supposed to be very well defined in terms of the amounts that get intermodal leases are predicted what the value will be over the course of the year. So a landlord will predict, okay, your additional rent operating costs are going to be $1,000 a month. You pay that, and then there's a reconciliation at the end of the year. So with the reduction in a lot of the operating costs or taxes and whatnot, that'll eventually be passed on. I'm just, and I just don't know whether they're getting passed on now or whether the landlords are taking advantage of those reduced costs and going to pass them on to the reconciliation at the end of the year. And, I've been seeing, I know anecdotally, most landlords are once they've figured out if there is a substantial reduction, will adjust and let their tenants know because they've been crying out for relief. But under the lease, often there's not like an immediate requirement to adjust your operating costs and taxes until that reconciliation period at the end of the year, or the end of your term or calendar year, or fiscal year, whatever's worked into the lease, or however the tenancy and the property is managed.
Okay, and remember, put in the chat there if you got any questions, please forward your questions. I got another one for you that I see there's one in there, but I'm going to ask you another one. What have you heard about where it comes from? Well, I was getting this early on, and I don't think, again, we don't have all the details yet. And my understanding is they're coming out next week. Mr. Morneau said they'd be mid-May, so that's mid-May is next week. About where they're basing it on. Is it the gross rent? Is it including everything, or is it just the rent? Because sometimes the taxes can be higher than the rent on the property. So what are they, have you heard anything about what they're going to base it on? I'm hearing the gross number, not the net.
Yeah, I don't know what that will look like. I don't know I think gross rent is what's necessary. And I think perhaps that's why they've called it a loan that's forgivable and whatnot, but because there might be some intricacies after, but they have not defined what rent means. And to capture everything, I mean, there's a lot of leases out that are not triple net. They might have a gross rent. So to make sure that it's apples to apples, I would like to think that they will do it on gross rent. However, we've had predictions of what's reasonable along the way here, and they haven't always addressed things. And I mean, look, I'm not trying to be too critical because these are difficult things to plan, but I'd like to think that it'll be gross rent because that would make the most sense, but it may bring up issues itself. Do you want me to review one of these questions here, Mike? Or
Sure, go for it.
so Kathy wrote in here, what will the documents look like once this comes into play? Have you heard anything from more specifics as to when this will start, mid-May? Well, Kathy, I think Mike almost can answer this better than I because I haven't heard much, but I know he's on the phone with the powers that be more than I am at the government level. And I think, Mike, you said they were trying to roll something out, more no promise by next week, to have the particulars of what's going to be happening, the application process, what's needed.
Yeah, when I'm on a call every morning with Small Business Canada and some other representatives from other jurisdictions. And I believe they keep telling us that, to the best of their knowledge, these are civil servants, that Mr. Murnau said mid-May, and that's what they're banking on, something coming out next week with some more of the details. They are alive to the things we brought up about needing a mortgage or not. That gets brought up across the country. And they are hearing it from all parts of the country because I'm on the calls, I'm hearing these people tell them, and they are alive to the whole, and that's where I believe I heard, yes, they're going to have a fix for that. And I believe that's where I was told it would be gross mortgage, not net. So I think those fixes are coming. So I'm hoping, my prediction is we'll have something by mid-May, which is next week.
Thanks, Mike. With the next question here, do you have to provide proof of the landlord that you are eligible for the loan, i.e. the 70% reduction in your revenue? Also, if the landlord is not willing to forego their 25%, can you offer that you would cover that and pay the combined 50% eligible for the relief? And this has come up a couple of times in my conversations with clients as well. And also just with landlords using this opportunity to really pry into the tenant's finances. And we still don't have many details, right? And that's one of the challenges. They released this program before May 1 in hopes that people and landlords would go, tenants and landlords would go, okay, thank you, there's relief coming. Let's make an agreement that we're not booting you out, that you either don't pay rent, or if you could pay rent, you can be confident that you'll get some back through this program, without releasing the details of everything. And I had clients who said, well, my landlord's not going to agree to reduce the rent by 25%. And like this question here, can we top it up? And I mean, my response at that time was, that's sort of a liability I anticipate that the landlord's going to have to be concerned about. I expect that the theory behind this is that everyone's got some skin in the game. If the government's going to give money, they don't want the landlord to be made whole, and that they reduce it by 25%, and then the tenant, covers 25%. And my thought was here is that I think it'll be mandatory that, it is mandatory so far, as based on the release that they've had, that the landlord reduce by 25% or by 75%, right, at a minimum, and that there be an agreement not to terminate the lease or evict the tenant. And so those are the very concrete rules. So I think if there's a side agreement where the tenant tops up the landlord, I would think that the landlord would be the one who would get hit with the wrath of the government as opposed to the tenant in that situation. But who knows at this point. And so the risk would likely lie on the one who's getting the benefit of lying to the government in that respect. But what I do also think is, I don't think it, from my understanding or reading of the release, is that it's not that the tenant must pay 25%. It's that the landlord must reduce the rent by at least 75% to get the 50%. So if a tenant can't pay anything, my impression of it, or my interpretation of it, is if you've got a very willing and agreeable landlord, which may not be the case, is willing to take 50% and only the government, there may be a complete rent abatement available. If that answers your question there.
I see Mark's asked a question there about eviction under the program.
Right. Is it also correct that the landlord has to agree not to evict under this program? If yes, how long do they have to agree not to evict for? Does that mean that they can't evict for any reason at all? That's a good question. I mean, I think that there was my understanding, and it was very, the terms of this were quite brief, right? So they haven't given the particulars, but it was very clear to me that there was no ability to evict. And I think it was primarily for the payment of rent to the agreed reduction amount. And that and there would be no eviction during that. I mean, I don't think it forgave the tenant from any other material breaches that would result in termination rights. And that wouldn't make sense to me. You know, all of a sudden the tenant has free reign to do anything they want in this sort of immunity period. I think it was the gist of it, and the goal was that, you know, a landlord can't kick someone out because the rent isn't paid. But, you know, the odd thing is that this is just a new agreement between the landlord and tenant. So, I mean, once you come to an agreement on something, the landlord can't kick the tenant out anyway if they're following that agreement.
Doesn't some of that fall into the provincial guidelines too? Isn't that provincial territory, evictions, not federal?
Yeah, I mean, that's why they've said there has to be an agreement between landlord and tenant. The landlord's going to agree that you don't have to pay your whole rent and they won't kick you out. But, you know, they could kick you out if you don't pay. I think if you don't come up with the 25%, I think there would still be some eviction rights there. But again, we don't have the particulars on it.
Okay. Any other questions by anybody? Anybody want to make a comment that they're having an experience right now without naming names? Are you finding your landlord's been amenable to talking and just waiting for details? What are you hearing out there? I know I've talked to a few of our members who are, it varies. A few have said they want to do, they're having problems and gotten basically eviction notices are, you know, it's been very difficult on a couple of them. And then a couple of them said they've been very good. So what are you hearing out there, folks? Anybody want to chime up and share an experience? No? Come on, don't be bashful.
Mike, there's one thing that I can add here, and that's my sort of thoughts on it. And I think that there's been sort of less concern perhaps as of yesterday's release from our provincial government of trying to get our economy and businesses open back up again. And sort of there's optimism hopefully now from a lot of businesses. Okay, well, you know, maybe this rent problem isn't going to be as much of a problem, and I'll get some relief hopefully with the landlord, and we'll be back up and running. You know, but I think this is where this rent relief proposal sort of fell down, and where the suggested relief that I had understood was going to come down, or I had been advised they were anticipating coming down based on percentage of reduced revenue, would have been more effective tool, because businesses are going back to work at a limited basis. And so if you're going back at 30, 40% capacity, 50% capacity, whatever it is, you know, these sort of extreme rent relief, what people need is, you know, a relief that's consistent and with their reduced revenues on a sliding scale has seemed to me a more appropriate way of dealing with this. You know, and maybe that's a way. I know a lot of tenants were trying to turn their leases over to, you know, percentage rent, which is something that in good times for businesses, they don't want to be giving the landlord their profits, but in bad times, they're hoping that the landlord shares in their struggles rather than paying just set fees. And you might see some more interesting arrangements that way, where, you know, landlords are like, okay, well, we'll give you the break of shifting over to percentage rent. And, you know, we'll help you get through this, but when you're back up and running and going really well, we want to upside on your business too.
I see Nav's asked another question in there, Daniel, if you want to take a look at that.
So could paying the rent for April and May possibly affect the landlord's willingness to apply for the relief and refund the landlord for those months? Also, is there a chance of a moratorium on the eviction coming out? I mean, as a landlord, I would certainly, if I'm getting paid rent, I'd be happy to keep 100% rather than giving 25% a month back. So yeah, it's a flaw with the program for those good tenants who are deciding that they don't want to put themselves at risk and not paying rent, are now disadvantaging themselves in the negotiations. So as I've always said, not paying rent can be a very good negotiating tactic, but it's just a risky one. In terms of our, what was the rest of the question? Moratorium on evictions, that there's call for that. I haven't heard anything whether it's happening or not. Our provincial government did it for residential. I know nationally that's not the case. And there's a lot of call for that to happen nationally. I've seen less chatter about that unless someone else has seen something I haven't in a commercial context. They're trying, commercial is a more arm's length, and you got into this, you're running your business, we're not going to interfere with your contractual relations as much, and therefore moratorium on evictions, they're more reluctant for in a commercial context is my understanding. I've got another question here. Oh, is that to everyone or okay? Yeah.
No, it's from Jeremy.
Yeah. So we have 2 leases, both of which are with intermediaries. The landlord is a sublessor, not the building owner. Are the feds alive to the need for a flow through of the subsidy? That is from the building owner to the sublessor to the end tenant. Our building owners are not at all sure they want to participate at the moment. Yeah, I mean, those are more complex agreements. I don't know what the government and the feds are alive to. My impression is that they're not very alive to the issues of private small business sector. They understand, large employee-based stuff. So I can't really speak to what they're alive to. I think that there would be in the application program, all of the parties with an interest in the property have to sort of participate in this, from landlord down to subtenant. Those are all interests in the property that they own, and there should be some flow through for sure. So it wouldn't make sense. And you're likely, so hopefully we'll have an ability for the end user, the end tenant, the sublessor, it'd be their revenue that are measured in terms of the qualification requirements.
Jeremy, save that one question just when the regulations come out, because I got a feeling that might be when they might fall through the cracks a bit. I can see that falling through the cracks a bit.
The subtenant issue might be more of an issue when you've got, what some people consider a lease, but it's really a license. Like for instance, a lot of salons that I've been talking to where they license out the chairs or the use of the space for things, or you've got some type of space where you lease out portions of use for it, yoga studio, gym, that sort of thing, where different users come in and pay a monthly fee to use the space. Those aren't really lease arrangements. Those are typically in a license agreement. And, you're not gonna, it's really the tenant is the sort of the owner of the one who has the ability to the lease of the space, and then they're just licensing out the use of it. I'd be surprised if it goes down that far down the road. It'll probably stop at the tenant, not the licensees. So Kathy here again, our landlord is being great and he is going to apply for this so we can benefit. We have agreed to pay rent, and in return we'll get back 75% of what we have verbally agreed to. We'll have to see what the application form looks like moving forward, but this has really helped us, as considering we're not using our space at all and we could have terminated the lease. Now we may not have to go to the termination option. No question, just a comment. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm surprised that I think most of the kickback and feedback I've been getting from the landlords isn't that they don't want to cooperate, just that they don't know if they qualify yet. They don't know what the rules are yet, and they're reluctant to agree to anything until they know what the parameters are. And so the tenants are frustrated because they're not getting solid answers from the landlords.
Yeah, I think the
I'm happy
timing
to hear you have.
Yeah, I think the timing and all this, if it had been done, everybody's hoping it had been announced before May, right? When rents were due, and the fact that it's not coming out to mid-May, and we've already gone through 2 periods that they're eligible for, has really thrown some confusion into things. So we'll see what they come out with. Any other last questions from anybody? Comments, questions, raise your hand. Oh, got a new one in there. Do we? I don't know. Oh, okay. All right. So I'm going to say thank you to Daniel for everything again. Again, when we scheduled this, we had anticipated that the regulations would have been out by now. I think logic would have dictated that they would have been out before the end of the month. But this is weird times we're dealing with, and logic always doesn't prevail. And so we will keep on top of it at the chamber. If you have any questions, please feel free to forward them on to me. Any concerns? I know I'm hearing from a few members about their concerns with landlords, and I'm trying to work through each one as best I can, given the resources we currently have. And we want to hear good stories and bad stories. We want to hear the good ones too, because we're not hearing a lot out there. Anyways, Daniel, any last comments? Anything, and where can we find you if they need help?
Yeah, just if anyone has any questions, I'm a phone call or an email away, and I'm happy to give a few minutes of my time for your specific issue that you weren't comfortable speaking out in this public forum. I just need to make sure I do my conflict searches. So I need landlord, tenant name, parties involved, and we can see if we can help you out as well. So thanks.
Okay, so Steph will send out that. Steph will send out contact info, right, Steph? For BTM. Perfect. They're in Port Moody. They're in Cedarbrooke. Easy to find. I'm not sure they're in the office or not, but it looks like he is, but I'm not sure he is.
That's a virtual background of my reception sign, but I am in my office.
Okay.
I'm just not in front of this reception sign.
And again, if you need anything from the chamber, we're sending out information as we get it. As soon as this information becomes available, we'll get it out to you. Feel free to contact us, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.